Greetings all. My name is Jason Colyer. I'm the support operations manager here at GitLab, and today we're going to go over how the sync repos work for Zendesk. We like to do as much of our work through the sync repos as possible. They allow for version controlling, they allow for easy rollbacks, they allow for an approve or review approve process. We really like to do as much of our work through these repos as possible. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get right into it. So what you see right now is the Zendesk macros project. This is where we hold all of the macros that are synced into Zendesk. I picked one at random, so there's no specific reason it's this one. So at its core, what we really have here is a GitLab CI file. And in this, we're specifying the image to be Ruby 2.5, just haven't gotten around to upgrading it yet. And we kind of set the stages of gather, sandbox, compare, and sync. Now, macros are a little specific. They used to sync to the sandbox. We have that disabled for the time being, but it could come back into play. We have the cache where we set the path of vendor Ruby. This is just so it doesn't take as much time installing gems between runs. And then we set up a before script where we're going to make sure to call the Ruby version. We do that just so we can check to make sure, yes, this is the version we intended to use. It's good for debugging. We then call gem install bundler. So we install bundler gem, and then from there we run bundle, which will install all the gems required. And we'll go over that as we go through the script. In that we kind of have 4 jobs currently that are active. We have the from Zendesk, which is part of this gather stage. And then it's going to run the Zendesk script, and it's going to create an artifact called zendesk.json, and it expires in 2 hours. This is so we don't retain it for too long. It really isn't needed beyond the actual runtime of the script itself. We also have the from repo job, which is also part of the gather stage. That's going to run the repo script. And it's also going to make an artifact that expires in 2 hours, but this one's data/repo.json. We then have the compare job, which runs in the compare stage. I've set this to have a needs of from Zendesk and from repo, which means these past 2 jobs, the from Zendesk here and the from repo here, they have to run and succeed for this to actually run. That's because it requires this zendesk.json and repo.json file, or files, I should say. It's going to run the compare script, and it'll generate 2 artifacts, the creates.json and the updates.json, which will also expire in 2 hours. And then we have the sync script. It's part of the sync stage. It needs this compare job to finish and succeed. From there, it's going to run the sync script, and it's only going to do this for when the ref is master. That's because we don't want it syncing to production for anything other than the master pipeline, the master branch. Now, beyond that, we'll take a quick look at the scripts here. So the Zendesk script, not very specific. It's basically just saying, require the Zendesk macros file and then run Zendesk macros, Zendesk artifacts. You'll find the other ones, such as the repo, are very similar. Zendesk macros, repo, artifacts. The compare job, you'll see it's pretty similar too. Zendesk macros, compare, report, and artifact, because we want a report of what it's about to do, but we also need the artifacts. And then the sync script is the other one to go over, and that one's just running. It just does Zendesk macros sync run. So the way these really work is coming from lib. We've got the Zendesk macros file. And here we're declaring the modules Zendesk macros. We've got it requiring JSON YAML Zendesk.api or Zendesk_API, which is the Zendesk API gem. And then we're going to require the clients file. And that's within here. The client file is going to specify some pretty mundane stuff. We're going to set the class to client. We're going to require the compare repo sandbox Zendesk files. We're going to declare the clients, which we're going to use this right here. We're going to call the Zendesk API gem, call the clients function, or client class, I should say. We're calling a new one. We're passing it in. The config of the URL is our environment URL. The username is the environment username. The token is the environment token. We want it to retry if it fails to make API connections, and we want the logger set to false, because otherwise it floods the thing with running this, running that, did this update, did this create. It's a lot, so we tend to just not want that present. When the sandbox stuff is running, we also declare one for the sandbox client. We also have something for the Zendesk clients. This is where we're going to call the Zendesk API. We're going to send it using a Faraday connection. The request is going to be URL encoded. It's going to use the default adapter for Faraday, and the private token will be a GitLab token. And then beyond that, we create a function called GitLab request, where it takes an HTTP method, the endpoint, and any parameters that we're passing in. From there, it's going to do a public send to the HTTP method using the endpoint and the params. And it's going to use YAML to safe load the response. And we're going to pass it this date to tell it parse dates as well. So beyond that, each of them kind of vary, but we'll go ahead and go into the Zendesk one first. For this one, we're defining the client. We're saying, yeah, pull the client from that client class that we just went over. The macros are going to be map macros, which is a function out here where it's going to call the client, get every macro from Zendesk, and then push them to an array using the macro object function. And then it's going to pass this macro right back. So what it's saying is the macros here is equal to all the macros, and they're passed in this specific object because this is what we need to work with syncs, updates, and so on and so forth. We need the ID, the title, the active state, description, actions, and restriction. And beyond that, we also have the artifact where it's going to artifact these macros into a JSON file using JSON style formatting. So beyond that, we have the repo script. That was the sync script. The repo script. Once again, it's going to do macros, map macros, but this time this is instead a little more complicated because we're reading from the repo here. It's going to call the errors to initialize this errors function, this errors shared object. It's going to call for active and inactive to get active files and inactive files. And you can see that down here where it's basically doing a blob on the active folder to locate all YAML files. On each file, it's going to attempt to safe load it. And if it errors out because it can't load it, it's actually going to send this error using the error function, which we'll go over in a bit. But if it doesn't, it's then going to check to see if it's active. If it's an inactive macro in this active folder, it's going to send out an error saying, hey, I've got an inactive macro in the active folder. Beyond that, it's going to call the check for errors function, which we'll go over in a bit. And if, once all that's done, it's going to push this to the active, class right here. And at the end, it's going to pass this through. So active files is really just every active macro. The inactive files are the same thing, but for inactive files. So once we got that, it's going to parse, it's going to send out all the errors that we have, and it's going to notify us of those, unless there's no errors. If there's no errors, it's going to say map macros is active plus inactive. It's going to add those two together, and that's how we get the macros. Now, the macro objects should look exactly the same as the Zendesk object for the other file. The error function literally just calls an abort and reads out what the error is. And we do this because we don't want to proceed. If it's failed to parse these, it's not going to succeed anywhere else. We want it to go ahead and stop. Now, the checks that we do, the tests that we do are looking for bad names, duplicate IDs, and duplicate names. And bad names, it's basically going to go through each name and send it out if it's got a bad name. Those are the report functions. Basically, the way we look for bad names is we look for anything in the bad names function. And in this case, the bad names function, there we go. Bad names. So we're basically just looking for each of these, and we're reporting if any of them have bad names. Now, the way this works is we're basically looking for any that use .yml. That's because the script specifically is looking for, if you remember up here, .yaml. So if it doesn't have it there, it's going to let you know, hey, you've got the wrong extension. We're looking for this. Duplicate IDs are what it sounds like. It's going to look through all of them and look and see if any two have the same ID function. If it does, it's going to report that, hey, two of these have duplicate IDs. We can't proceed. We can't have them conflicting like that. And duplicate names are the exact same way. If it finds two with the same names, it's going to report. While Zendesk will let them sync with the same name, we try to avoid that as much as possible because it causes a lot of confusion when two things have the exact same name. Beyond all that, it's going to end up with a, data repo JSON file to the artifact, which will be used later on. So beyond that, we've got the compare script. This one's a little less complicated, but basically we're going to call the Zendesk macros client. From Zendesk, we're going to parse this data JSON file that we made. From the repos, we're going to parse this repo file. And then we're going to set some global variables up here using updates, creates, and deletes. So it's going to report an artifact. Report is basically going to run the compare script, which is going to go through everything in the repo folder, or repo JSON file, and everything in the Zendesk JSON file, and compare them. If it finds ones that exist in both, but there's differences, it's going to say, oh, I need to update this. The repo is the single source of truth in this, so it'll push that there. If it finds one where, hey, it exists in the repo, but not in Zendesk, it's going to say, I need to create that, push it to the creates file. We kind of want to build in the function for deletes. We don't actively do it right now. It'll report that, hey, this exists in Zendesk, but not in the repo. I think I need to delete it, but we don't actively having it doing these deletes. But basically, by the end of this, what we're going to end up with is 2 artifact files, which you can see down here. With the artifacts, we've got updates JSON and creates JSON. This is going to be passed to the sync script, which will help it figure out what to do. Which brings us to our final script, the sync script. Now, once again, this is going to call the Zendesk client. It's going to parse the creates file and the updates file. And it's going to create some functions here of created 0, updated 0, and errors is kind of this hash object. We're going to use this mainly for reporting. So the pre-run report is going to tell us, hey, I need to create this many macros and this many, I need to update this many macros. Now, beyond that, it's going to actually run the creation. And if we look down here at run, we see create happens first, then update, then post run, and then the error report. So for created, it's literally going to go through all the created, the creates, and just create the macro, which is going to call the Zendesk API create, passing the client and the macro. It's going to add 1 to it, but if it errors because it's invalid, it's going to store that in our errors hash so we can report on it later. Next up, it's going to update, which is going to look very similar. It's going to update the macros. We call the Zendesk API macro update function, pass the client macro, add 1 to update. But if it fails because the record's invalid, we want it to log that. Now, beyond that, it's going to do a post-run report where it's going to say, I created this many macros and I updated this many macros. You'll notice above in these, the adding 1 is after it tries to create it. So it'll error before it adds to 1. That way, we're not saying, I created 5, but 4 of them errored. Then we're going to do the error report, which is basically just going to go through the errors and print out what the error actually is. And you can see up here, we have the error string function, which is just going to be unable to create an update macro title due to error, and then the actual error that it encountered. So that's basically all there is to this. So there's some configuration settings we have in place for the projects. Not going to show those because they would show the variables, and that's unsafe. But that's the basic gist of how the repo syncs work. I hope you found this educational. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, feel free to reach out to myself, the support operations channel, create issues on the projects, all that fun stuff. And I look forward to seeing you next time.